Tell us what the woodsmen say.
Christopher Lee was not sitting around the table with the rest of us. His contribution to the scene was filmed in London.
Most people think they know Sir Christopher Lee. The voice, the height, and the roles that made generations of audiences genuinely uncomfortable in darkened cinemas. But Viggo Mortensen spent months watching him work on the Lord of the Rings set, close enough to see things the camera never captured, and he said almost nothing about it publicly for over 2 decades. Just silence. Until finally at 67, something changed. Mortensen started talking, and what came out was not the kind of polished remembrance that actors usually offer about deceased colleagues. It was something more specific, details that would break everything most people think they already know about the man. So what exactly did Viggo Mortensen see in Christopher Lee that took him this long to put into words? Join us as we find out what he's been holding back all this time. Lord of the Rings. Peter Jackson's decision to film all 3 Lord of the Rings movies simultaneously remains one of the most ambitious production choices in cinema history. Beginning in 1999 in New Zealand, the cast spent the better part of 2 years working through scenes from all 3 films on a rotating schedule, sometimes shooting a scene from Fellowship of the Ring on a Monday and jumping to Return of the King material by Wednesday. This meant that actors spent nearly the entire shoot living inside their characters, and the bonds formed between cast members during that extended period were unlike anything a standard film production creates. Viggo Mortensen was a late addition to the cast, joining only days into filming after being offered the role of Aragorn in a phone call with Peter Jackson, which required him to fly to New Zealand almost immediately. Despite this rushed entry, Mortensen threw himself into the work completely, training before dawn to master swordsmanship and horseback riding, while the rest of the production was already underway. Swordmaster Bob Anderson, a veteran of film combat who had trained actors across decades of productions, reportedly called Mortensen the finest swordsman he had ever worked with. That level of dedication was unmatched. The cast of the trilogy was extensive, including Elijah Wood as Frodo, Ian McKellen as Gandalf, Orlando Bloom as Legolas, Kate Blanchett as Galadriel, Hugo Weaving as Elrond, Sean Bean as Boromir, and Christopher Lee as Wizard Saruman. The age gap between Mortensen and Lee was considerable. Mortensen was in his early 40s when filming began, while Lee was 79 years old when the first film was released in 2001, making him by far the oldest principal cast member on the project. This gap in life experience between the 2 men was wide, and it shaped the nature of every interaction they had. When The Lord of the Rings began filming in 1999, Lee had initially hoped to play Gandalf himself, a role he had dreamed about for decades as a devoted reader of Tolkien's work. He conceded in later commentary that he was too old in his mid-70s for the physical demands of the Gandalf role, which required far more horseback riding and fighting than Saruman. Rather than treating the casting of Saruman as a lesser prize, Lee embraced the character with the same total commitment he had brought to every significant role throughout a career spanning more than half a century. Christopher Lee was the only person involved in Peter Jackson's films who had actually met J.R.R. Tolkien in person, having encountered the author at a pub in Oxford during the 1950s, and he read the novels in their entirety at least once a year. This gave Lee a connection to the source material that no other actor on the production could claim, and it proved the seriousness with which he prepared for and performed the role of Saruman across both The Lord of the Rings and later the Hobbit trilogies. Walking onto a film set carrying that kind of relationship with the source text placed Lee in a category entirely his own. During filming of Saruman's demise scene for Return of the King, Peter Jackson began coaching Lee on how to react when his character was stabbed in the back. Lee interrupted him, pointing out that he had direct personal experience of knowing exactly what sound a man makes when stabbed in the back. The room went quiet. Jackson allowed Lee to proceed without further instruction. That single moment in the production tells an entire story about the weight of lived experience Lee brought with him onto any film set, and the kind of effect it had on everyone around him. By all accounts, Lee and Ian McKellen got along warmly on set, despite the competitive history between their two characters. Lee described McKellen as encouraging and a constant companion throughout the production. His relationship with Mortensen developed across a very different dynamic, one defined not by characters who opposed each other on screen, but by two actors who shared great respect for the craft of storytelling. Mortensen, who brought his own multi-layered approach to every role, found himself on a set with a man whose relationship with cinema stretched all the way back to 1948. Lee visited New Zealand 4 times during production, with his longest stay running approximately 10 weeks. The practical requirements of his role meant that his time on the physical New Zealand sets was more limited than some other cast members, but his presence when he was there carried a particular weight. Peter Jackson, who had grown up watching Hammer Productions' horror films featuring Lee, wanted him to bring a similar energy to Saruman, a commanding, deeply villainous screen presence built from decades of experience. The two men, Mortensen and Lee, represented something rare in modern film production: actors who treated every moment in front of a camera as an opportunity to discover something true about the character rather than simply perform a version of it. Mortensen's method was to live inside Aragorn as completely as possible during the entire shoot. Lee's method came from decades of trial and error, from surviving an industry that had repeatedly underestimated him, and from having seen things in real life that no script had ever required him to invent. And it was during that period that a spark was lit: Christopher Lee's extraordinary life. Few actors have ever arrived on a film set carrying the kind of biography Christopher Lee brought with him. Born on May 27, 1922, in Belgravia, London, Lee was the son of an Italian countess and a British Army lieutenant colonel, and grew up in a world that connected him to figures most people only read about in history books. His stepfather's family connections brought a young Christopher Lee into contact with Ian Fleming, the man who would later create James Bond, and the two became step-cousins. This was not the life of an ordinary aspiring actor finding his way through drama school auditions. During the Second World War, Lee volunteered to fight alongside the Finnish army against the Soviet Union in 1939 as a teenager, though practical limitations prevented him from engaging in direct combat. When Britain went to war in earnest, Lee returned and enlisted in the Royal Air Force. He wanted to fly, but a damaged optic nerve made him ineligible for pilot training. So instead, he became an intelligence officer, eventually reaching the rank of flight lieutenant. His language abilities covered 6 languages, including French and German, making him particularly valuable in intelligence work. Lee was posted to North Africa, where he was based alongside the Long Range Desert Group, the predecessor unit of the modern SAS, moving across territory from Egypt through Tobruk to Benghazi. He also used his language skills to track Nazi war criminals alongside the Central Registry of War Criminals and Security Suspects, work that required him to visit concentration camps and interrogate suspects. These were not experiences that could be filed away and forgotten. They stayed with him, and they surfaced decades later in his work in ways that most viewers never knew they were witnessing. Lee himself rarely discussed his wartime service in depth, and the exact nature of some of his activities remains difficult to verify because he always deflected detailed questions throughout his life. Historians have argued where the exact boundaries of his service lay, but what is not disputed is that Lee came out of the war as someone who had witnessed genuine violence, genuine suffering, and the real consequences of human cruelty at scale. He described seeing men die from torture, mutilation, and explosive blasts, and spoke of developing a kind of psychological shell just to keep functioning in the face of that exposure. This background shaped the way Lee understood villainy when he eventually moved into acting after the war. Lee once observed that he never looked on the villains and monsters he played as purely evil or scary, noting that he always felt a kind of sympathy for them, sensing that they didn't necessarily want to be what they had become. That empathy, rooted in a man who had genuinely seen the worst of what humans are capable of, gave his performances a texture that actors without that lived experience simply could not replicate by technique alone. Lee's career in film reached more than 60 years, and across that time he appeared as Count Dracula in 7 Hammer horror productions, played the James Bond villain Francisco Scaramanga in The Man with the Golden Gun, portrayed Count Dooku across multiple Star Wars films, and took the role of Saruman through both the Lord of the Rings and Hobbit trilogies. More than 280 film appearances in total, more than most actors accumulate in a lifetime. And each one carried the same strength of purpose that Lee brought to every character he agreed to take on. Lee himself considered his finest performance to be his portrayal of Pakistani founder Muhammad Ali Jinnah in the 1998 biopic Jinnah, a role entirely unlike anything he had become famous for, and one that demanded an emotional and historical sensitivity that his horror work rarely required. The fact that Lee considered that researched biographical performance his best work reveals something important about how he understood his own craft. The monsters and wizards and villains were never the destination. They were the work he did while waiting for the world to catch up with what he was actually capable of. Lee was knighted in June 2009 for services to drama and charity, received the BAFTA Fellowship in 2011, and the BFI Fellowship in 2013, 3 of the most significant honors the British entertainment world offers. Even his music career defied expectation. At age 87, he released a symphonic metal concept album about Charlemagne, followed by a second installment at 90 years old, and in 2012, he entered the Billboard Hot 100 chart, becoming the oldest living performer to chart there. When Viggo Mortensen shared a set with this man, he was standing next to someone whose life story alone would fill several books. The sheer volume of human experience concentrated in one person, and the particular way Lee carried all of it without performance or self-promotion, was something that a careful observer would spend years processing. What Mortensen noticed about how Lee translated that experience into his craft, and why it took him until age 67 to speak about it fully, is where this story becomes genuinely revealing. Becoming Aragorn. Peter Jackson's Aragorn was almost never Viggo Mortensen. Before filming began, another actor held the role for weeks, learning lines, meeting the cast, settling into a part that seemed already decided. Then everything fell apart in a matter of days. What happened behind the scenes involved a stunned director, a father torn between his son and his career, and a 9-year-old boy whose single question changed the course of movie history without him ever knowing it. Before Mortensen ever set foot in New Zealand, the role of Aragorn belonged to someone else. Stuart Townsend, a young Irish actor coming off the success of About Adam, had already been cast and had spent weeks preparing under Jackson's guidance. On set, everything started falling apart almost right away. Townsend showed little interest in the physical work the role demanded. He skipped rehearsals, avoided horseback training, and brushed off sword choreography sessions that the rest of the cast treated seriously. When people pushed him to prepare, he kept giving the same answer, saying he would simply get it right on the day of filming. Ian McKellen, who played Gandalf, noticed the pattern before anyone else said anything out loud. He pulled Townsend aside privately and asked him something simple but direct, wondering out loud whether the younger actor even wanted to be part of the production at all. The question did not seem to change anything. By the second day of actual shooting, Jackson had seen enough. He turned to his producer and said he did not think he could keep working with Townsend. Just like that, the actor who had trained for weeks was gone. and the production found itself without a lead only days into filming a massive trilogy. Then the search for a replacement moved fast and under pressure. Jason Patric came up as an option, but got dismissed for not carrying enough star power. Russell Crowe, still riding the wave of Gladiator's success, turned the part down outright, saying he had no interest in getting boxed into another period epic so soon. That left Viggo Mortensen, a name far less obvious at the time. He rode horses well, spent time outdoors, and already carried a deep familiarity with European folklore, meaning Tolkien's mythological world was not entirely foreign territory for him. Even so, his first instinct when offered the role was to say no. His son Henry was young, and taking the part meant vanishing to New Zealand for months, at a stretch of his son's childhood he did not want to miss. He weighed the offer half-heartedly, the way any father might when a career opportunity collides with something that matters more to him personally. However, it was Henry who tipped things the other way. Already deeply invested in the books, the boy caught wind of what his father was hesitating over and refused to let it slide. He asked his father directly whether he planned to deny him the chance to see his own dad play Aragorn on screen. Mortensen has repeated that story countless times since, always sounding faintly amazed at how easily his son cut through weeks of internal debate. At that point, he had not even read the books. Yet he agreed, because his son asked him to, long before he understood the weight of what he had just accepted. Within days, he was on a flight to New Zealand. He landed with no rehearsal behind him, no real connection to his co-stars, and barely any grasp of who Aragorn was meant to be. Jackson later admitted that during Mortensen's earliest scenes, especially the prancing pony introduction, the uncertainty on screen was real, not acted. Fans who have picked apart that scene over the years often point out something unexpected. The nervous energy Mortensen carried into his first days actually strengthened the performance instead of weakening it. Aragorn, at that stage in the story, is a man avoiding his own fate, unsettled in his identity, unwilling to be recognized for who he truly is. An actor thrown into the role with almost no preparation had no chance to fake confidence, and that rawness gave Jackson something rehearsal could never have produced. The hesitation visible in Mortensen's eyes during that early scene was not something that needed fixing. By pure accident, it matched the character perfectly, but things shifted quickly after that. During the confrontation with the ring wraiths at Weathertop, Jackson watched something click into place on camera. Mortensen leaned into the darker, more feral side, hiding beneath Aragorn's noble exterior, and the now famous shot of him swinging a lit torch toward the lens was never planned. It happened in the moment. From there, his commitment only deepened. He trained on horseback so consistently that he bought his horse once filming wrapped and paid for Arwen's horse as well, after nobody else would match the asking price for Liv Tyler's stunt double. He also refused to fight with rubber or aluminum props, insisting on a real steel sword that he practiced with constantly, even off-set, a habit that led to a few tense run-ins with local police. The film's fight choreographer later called him the finest swordsman he had ever coached. During filming, he broke 2 toes kicking a helmet, and the genuine yell of pain stayed in the final cut. He cracked a tooth during the helm's deep sequence and chose to see a dentist still dressed in costume and fake blood rather than risk breaking continuity for a single shot. Jackson once spent half an hour talking with him, only to realize afterward that he had called him Aragorn the entire time, never once using his real name. It was somewhere inside that intense, almost obsessive devotion to authenticity Mortensen crossed paths with Christopher Lee. A lasting artistic influence. Viggo Mortensen is not a man who talks about acting in abstract terms. Across his career, he has consistently described the work in practical and physical language, focused on preparation, on research, on finding the specific details that make a character feel inhabited rather than performed. During the Lord of the Rings production, this approach manifested in remarkable ways, including training in swordsmanship before dawn each morning and an almost total immersion in the identity of Aragorn throughout the shoot. When he encountered Christopher Lee on the same production, he was watching someone whose approach to the same fundamental challenges looked completely different from the outside, and yet arrived at results that were in many ways even more deeply grounded. Lee did not spend weeks living as Saruman before arriving on set, and he did not require elaborate personal rituals to find the character. What he had instead was something that cannot be taught and cannot be rushed, which is the total instinct of more than 50 years of professional acting experience, during which he had played hundreds of characters across every possible genre and style. By the time a performer reaches that point, the preparation becomes invisible because it is no longer separate from the way they exist in general. One of the most revealing moments on the Lord of the Rings set occurred during the filming of Saruman's death scene. What Mortensen would have observed in that moment was not just a piece of biographical color. He would have seen a demonstration of how a life fully lived, with real consequences and real exposure to extreme human experience, feeds directly into the truthfulness of a performance in ways that no amount of preparation can. This is one of the things Mortensen has spoken about when discussing the gap between technical craft and genuine presence on screen. Technique produces competence. Living produces something else, a quality of weight in small moments, a convincing relationship with silence and stillness. The ability to communicate something without moving. Lee had that quality to an unusual degree, and it was directly traceable to the fact that his biography was truly extraordinary rather than eventful in the ordinary way of show business careers. Mortensen has described his own approach to filmmaking, both as an actor and later as a director, as rooted in the belief that everything he has learned has come from watching carefully, from paying attention to how people with more experience navigate the gap between intention and execution. Lee gave him something very specific to watch, a master class in how to hold an audience's attention using almost nothing. Saruman communicated power through a particular quality of Lee's voice, which even in his late 70s retained the kind of resonance that made everything he said feel weighted with consequence. Peter Jackson has noted that Lee's deep, commanding voice and his decades of experience playing villains were central to why Saruman worked so well as a character, and why Jackson wanted Lee specifically for the role, rather than simply a capable actor of that generation. What Mortensen absorbed from watching that being produced live on set was a lesson about restraint, about trusting the character to carry the scene without needing to push it. Aragorn, the character Mortensen was building in the same production, required a very different energy, but the underlying lesson about economy of performance translated directly. Lee also demonstrated something important about commitment at a stage in a career when many actors begin to disengage. Lee had spent years trying to move beyond the typecasting that his long run of Dracula films had created, relocating to America in the 1970s in search of more varied work, and continuing to push for interesting and meaningful roles long after he could easily have settled into comfortable repetition. By the time he reached The Lord of the Rings, he brought exactly the same standards to Saruman that he would have brought to any role at any earlier point in his career. Lee's own view of his career was notably at odds with how the public perceived him. This gap between how the world sees a performer and how the performer sees their own work is something Mortensen understood very much, having spent years producing serious, adventurous work across European cinema that got little of the attention his Hollywood blockbuster appearances generated. He recognized that quality in Lee, a man who kept his own counsel about what mattered most, regardless of what the industry rewarded. And this confirmed something important about what kind of actor Mortensen wanted to remain as his career developed. Legacy and reflection. Christopher Lee passed away on June 7, 2015, at Chelsea and Westminster Hospital in London, at the age of 93, following treatment for respiratory problems and heart failure. He had been married to his wife Birgit for more than 50 years, and the decision to release news of his passing was delayed by several days so that she could inform family members personally before the public announcement was made. During that initial wave of public mourning, Viggo Mortensen seemed to be processing the loss in a different register than the public conversation allowed for. Lee had spent more than 60 years building one of the most unusual and expansive filmographies in the history of British cinema, becoming known for a screen presence and a vocal quality that could carry menace and authority simultaneously without tipping into pantomime villainy. The awards and honors that came at the end of his career represented the industry's formal recognition that what Lee had been doing across those years warranted the highest available acknowledgement. For much of his career, particularly during the years when Hammer horror typecasting limited how seriously critics took his work, that acknowledgement had been slow in arriving. Even at 91 years old, Lee entered the Billboard Hot 100 chart through a heavy metal cover of Jingle Bells, becoming the oldest living performer ever to chart there, a record that seemed to sum up his entire relationship with expectations and categories. Nobody could predict what Christopher Lee would do next, because he had spent his entire life refusing to be contained by what people assumed he was. His two-part concept album about Charlemagne, released in 2010 and 2013, involved him portraying the Holy Roman Emperor across 30 tracks of symphonic metal. Mortensen's decision to speak at length about Lee a decade after his passing reflects something about how certain kinds of influence take time to fully understand. The Lord of the Rings production wrapped more than 20 years before Mortensen broke his longer silence on the subject, and in the intervening years, Mortensen had continued working at a consistently high level, adding Cronenberg films, European productions, and his own directorial work to a career already defined by Aragorn. All of that experience gave him new context for understanding what he had witnessed in New Zealand. Mortensen founded Percival Press in 2002 specifically to publish work that would otherwise go unrecognized, a project that reveals how seriously he takes the idea that artistic contribution should not require commercial validation to be worth preserving. Lee spent decades making the same argument through his choices, accepting roles long after his commercial pulling power would have allowed him to stop taking risks. The Wicker Man in 1973, Jinnah in 1998. His return to Hammer in 2011 at nearly 90 years old. These were all choices driven by artistic interest rather than career strategy. What Mortensen brings to his reflection on Lee's legacy is the perspective of someone who genuinely understood what Lee was trying to do, not just as a craftsman, but as a person committed to keeping his work honest across the longest possible span of time. Both men share a resistance to the parts of the entertainment industry that reward image management over substance, and a corresponding commitment to the kind of work that requires real investment rather than calculated positioning. Recognizing that shared value in another person forms the foundation of the kind of admiration that Mortensen has carried for Lee. Lee's voice was used posthumously in the 2024 animated Lord of the Rings film The War of the Rohirrim, with his widow giving her blessing for archival recordings to be employed. The production team noting that Lee himself would have wanted to be part of the continuation of that world. The fact that his voice alone, drawn from recordings made years before his demise, was considered the only appropriate choice for the character he had defined says something important about the irreplaceability of what Lee created in those roles. Both men built careers on the same fundamental belief, that the work itself is the point, that performing with total commitment, regardless of the size or prestige of the role, is the only approach worth taking, and that the audience can tell the difference between an actor who means it and one who does not. Lee demonstrated that on a set in New Zealand, and Mortensen has spent the 2 decades since doing the same in his own way. The question that lingers is what it actually means for a career to leave that kind of mark, not on box office records or award tallies, but on the working habits and creative standards of the serious actors who were paying attention. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.